The great hall of Ravenshollow Castle echoed with the clatter of pewter cups and the low murmur of noble voices as King Edmund surveyed the parchment before him. Candlelight flickered across the ornate script, casting dancing shadows on the treaty that would bind his kingdom to Duke Aldric of Northmarch for the next 20 years. The alliance promised prosperity, shared military might, and an end to the border skirmishes that had plagued both realms for generations. Sir Gareth Blackwood stood in the shadows near the massive stone hearth, his weathered face creased with concern. Unlike the other knights present, Gareth wore no silk or velvet beneath his mail. His sword bore the nicks of countless battles, and his boots showed the wear of a man who had walked among common soldiers rather than lounged in castle chambers. He had served 3 kings faithfully, rising from the ranks through merit rather than birthright, earning respect through deed rather than gold. The king's chancellor, Lord Reginald, adjusted his fur-trimmed robes and cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, the terms are most favourable. Duke Aldric offers 2,000 marks in silver, exclusive trading rights through the northern passes, and his daughter's hand in marriage to Prince William. In return, we merely provide military support should his lands face invasion." Murmurs of approval rippled through the assembled nobles. Lord Marcus of Eastdale nodded vigorously, his rings catching the firelight as he gestured. "The Duke's silver mines are legendary, sire. This pact could fill our treasury for years to come." Sir Gareth stepped forward, his spurs ringing against the stone floor. The sound cut through the comfortable chatter like a blade through silk. "Your Majesty, if I may speak?" King Edmund looked up from the parchment, surprised. Gareth rarely spoke in formal court, preferring action to words. "Of course, Sir Gareth. Your counsel has served me well in darker times." The poor knight's calloused hands remained steady at his sides, though tension showed in the set of his shoulders. "I have travelled Duke Aldric's lands recently, my lord. What I witnessed troubles me greatly." Lord Reginald's eyes narrowed. "Sir Gareth, surely you cannot question the wisdom of this alliance. The benefits are clear to any man with sense." Gareth's gaze never wavered from the king. "The Duke's subjects live in fear, Your Majesty. I saw villages burned for failing to meet impossible grain quotas. Children starving while their lord's warehouses overflow with tribute. The silver he offers comes from mines worked by men who die young from breathing poisoned air." The great hall fell silent except for the crackling of logs in the hearth. Several nobles shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Lord Marcus's face flushed red with indignation. "How dare you question our sovereign's judgment with such wild tales?" King Edmund raised his hand for silence, his weathered face thoughtful. He had known Gareth for 15 years, had seen him lead desperate charges when younger knights faltered, had watched him share his rations with wounded enemies. The man's honour was beyond question, but political alliances required different considerations than battlefield tactics. "These are serious accusations, Sir Gareth," the king said slowly. "Duke Aldric has shown nothing but courtesy in our negotiations. His emissaries speak of prosperity and mutual benefit." Gareth's voice remained steady, though those who knew him well could hear the underlying passion. "Emissaries speak what their lord wishes heard, Your Majesty. I speak only what these eyes have seen. The Duke rules through fear and cruelty. To bind our kingdom to his would stain our honour and endanger our people." The Chancellor stepped forward, his silk robes rustling. "Your Majesty, Sir Gareth speaks from emotion rather than reason. One night's observations cannot outweigh the careful negotiations of months. The treaty offers security and prosperity." Young Prince William, barely 18 and eager to prove himself, leaned forward in his chair. "Father, surely the stories are exaggerated. Duke Aldric's daughter is said to be both beautiful and learned. The marriage alliance alone would secure our northern borders." Sir Gareth turned to face the prince, his expression grave. "Your Highness, I have seen Lady Catherine. She bears bruises that no fall from a horse could explain. She flinches when men raise their voices, and her ladies whisper of her father's rages." The king stood slowly, his hand resting on the pommel of his ceremonial sword. The weight of crown and responsibility showed in his lined face as he considered the conflicting counsel before him. Outside the castle walls, his people slept peacefully, trusting in his wisdom to guide their kingdom safely through the treacherous currents of medieval politics. "The treaty signing is set for tomorrow," King Edmund said finally. "I will consider your words carefully, Sir Gareth." But as the poor knight bowed and stepped back into the shadows, he knew that gold and political necessity often spoke louder than warnings of distant cruelty. The die seemed cast, and tomorrow would seal the fate of 2 kingdoms. The moon hung like a silver coin above Ravenshollow Castle as Sir Gareth made his way through the narrow corridors toward the servants' quarters. Sleep eluded him, and his mind churned with images of what he had witnessed in Duke Aldric's territory. The castle had settled into the quiet rhythm of night, with only the occasional footstep of guards making their rounds echoing through the stone passages. In the kitchen, he found Martha, the head cook who had served the castle for 30 years. She sat by the dying embers of the great hearth, mending a torn apron by candlelight. Her weathered hands paused in their work as she looked up at the knight's troubled face. "Cannot sleep, Sir Gareth?" she asked, setting aside her needlework. "You look as though you carry the weight of the kingdom on your shoulders." Gareth settled onto a wooden stool beside her, grateful for the simple warmth of human companionship. Martha had known him since he first arrived at court as a young squire, had fed him countless meals when he returned bloodied and exhausted from campaigns. She possessed the wisdom that came from observing the powerful while remaining invisible herself. "Tell me, Martha," he said quietly, "what do the servants whisper about tomorrow's treaty? The common folk often see truths that escape the notice of nobles." The old woman's face grew serious as she poked at the coals with an iron rod. "Dark things, Sir Gareth. The merchants who trade with Duke Aldric's lands speak of terrible conditions. They say his tax collectors take not just grain and silver, but young men for his armies and young women for his pleasure. Families torn apart, villages emptied." Gareth nodded grimly. "I feared as much, yet the king seems determined to proceed. The promise of silver and military alliance blinds him to the cost." Martha leaned closer, lowering her voice to barely above a whisper. "There are other whispers too, my lord, about Duke Aldric's true intentions. Some say he seeks not alliance but dominion, that he has made similar pacts with 3 other kingdoms, always positioning himself as the stronger partner." The knight's blood chilled at these words. If true, it meant King Edmund was not gaining an ally, but potentially surrendering his independence piece by piece. Where do these whispers come from? The Duke's own servants, when they think none can hear. They speak of maps in his private chambers, marked with territories he claims will be his within a decade. Our kingdom is but one jewel in a crown he plans to forge through treaties rather than conquest. Before Gareth could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed in the corridor. Both fell silent as Prince William appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face flushed from wine and his doublet askew. The young prince had clearly been unable to sleep as well, though for different reasons. "Sir Gareth," William said, swaying slightly, "I hoped I might find you here. I wanted to speak about your words in the great hall." Martha quietly gathered her mending and slipped away, leaving the 2 men alone by the dying fire. The prince slumped into her vacated chair, running his hands through his dark hair. "You spoke against the marriage," William continued, his words slightly slurred. "You said Lady Catherine bears bruises. How can you be certain they come from her father's hand?" Gareth studied the young man carefully. Despite his privileged upbringing, William possessed a good heart and genuine concern for his subjects. Perhaps there was hope yet. "I watched her for 3 days during the feast at Northmarch Castle," Gareth replied. "I saw how she flinched when Duke Aldric raised his hand to gesture. I noticed how she kept her sleeves pulled down to cover marks on her wrists. Most telling of all, I saw the fear in her lady's eyes when they spoke of her." The prince's face sobered as the implications settled in his wine-fogged mind. "But surely my father would not bind me to such a union if he knew." "Your father sees what he wishes to see, your highness. The treasury grows thin from recent campaigns against the border raiders. The promise of Duke Aldric's silver speaks louder than a poor knight's warnings." William stood unsteadily and began pacing before the hearth. "What would you have me do? Refuse the marriage? Shame our kingdom by breaking a treaty before it is even signed?" Gareth rose as well, placing a steadying hand on the prince's shoulder. "I would have you speak truth to your father. Tell him of your concerns. A king may dismiss the words of a landless knight, but the doubts of his heir carry greater weight." The prince nodded slowly, though uncertainty still clouded his features. "And if he refuses to listen? If he insists the alliance must proceed?" The question hung in the air like smoke from the dying fire. Gareth had served 3 kings and learned that sometimes loyalty required opposing one's sovereign's will to serve the greater good. But such choices carried terrible consequences. "Then we pray your father's wisdom exceeds our fears," Gareth said finally. but we prepare for the possibility that it does not. As dawn approached, both men knew the morning would bring decisions that would echo through history. The treaty awaited the king's seal, Duke Aldric's delegation prepared for the ceremony, and somewhere in the shadows, forces moved that would test every oath of loyalty sworn within Ravenshollow's walls. Dawn broke grey and cold over Ravenshollow Castle as servants scurried through the corridors preparing for the treaty ceremony. The great hall had been transformed overnight with tapestries bearing both kingdoms' heraldry, long tables laden with silver goblets and braziers filled with glowing coals to ward off the morning chill. Duke Aldric's delegation had arrived before sunrise, their black and gold banners snapping in the bitter wind that swept across the castle walls. King Edmund stood before his private mirror as his valet adjusted the ceremonial crown upon his greying head. The weight of it seemed heavier this morning, and the face that stared back at him showed every one of his 47 years. Sleep had come fitfully, plagued by dreams of burning villages and the echo of Sir Gareth's warning. A knock at the chamber door interrupted his brooding. "Enter," he called, expecting his chancellor with final preparations for the ceremony. Instead, Prince William stepped into the room, his young face pale but determined. He had clearly spent the remaining hours of night in thought rather than rest, and his usually immaculate appearance showed signs of his internal struggle. "Father, I must speak with you before the ceremony begins," William said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. The king turned from the mirror, noting the serious expression on his son's face. "Of course, William. Are you having doubts about the marriage? It is natural for a young man to feel nervous before such a momentous commitment." William took a deep breath, drawing upon the courage his tutors had tried to instill in him through years of training in statecraft and warfare. "It is not nervousness that troubles me, father. It is conscience." King Edmund's eyebrows rose at the gravity in his son's tone. "Explain yourself. I spoke with Sir Gareth last night. His concerns about Duke Aldric run deeper than mere dislike of harsh rule. There are reports that the Duke seeks not alliance but dominion over his treaty partners, that our kingdom may be trading independence for silver." The king's expression hardened. "These are serious accusations, William. Do you have proof beyond the word of a knight whose holdings consist of a single manor and a handful of retainers?" Prince William moved to the window, gazing down at the courtyard where Duke Aldric's men prepared their horses. Even from this distance, he could see the rigid discipline that spoke of an army rather than a diplomatic escort. "Look at his delegation, father. 50 armed men for a treaty signing. His soldiers wear battle gear beneath their ceremonial cloaks." King Edmund joined his son at the window, his practiced eye taking in details he had previously overlooked. The Duke's men indeed carried themselves with the alertness of warriors expecting trouble, rather than the relaxed bearing of ceremonial guards. "Perhaps the Duke is merely cautious," Edmund said, though doubt crept into his voice. "The roads between our kingdoms have known bandits." Before William could respond, another knock echoed through the chamber. This time Lord Reginald entered, his arms full of documents and his face flushed with excitement. "Your Majesty, Duke Aldric requests a private audience before the ceremony. He wishes to discuss additional terms that will make the alliance even more beneficial." The king and prince exchanged glances. Additional terms at the last moment suggested either genuine generosity or hidden agenda. "What manner of additional terms?" Edmund asked. The Chancellor's smile widened. "He offers to station a permanent garrison here at Ravenshollow for our protection. 500 of his finest soldiers, maintained at his expense, to guard our northern approaches." William's face went pale. "A garrison of foreign soldiers in our own castle?" Lord Reginald looked puzzled by the prince's dismayed tone. "Think of the savings to our treasury, Your Highness. No need to maintain our own expensive standing army when Duke Aldric provides protection freely." King Edmund felt a chill run down his spine as the implications became clear. A foreign garrison in his castle would effectively place his kingdom under Duke Aldric's control. No enemy army could be more dangerous than supposed allies quartered within one's walls. "Tell the Duke I will consider his generous offer," Edmund said carefully. "But first I wish to review the original treaty terms once more." As the Chancellor hurried away, father and son stood in heavy silence. The trap was becoming visible at last, baited with silver and promises of prosperity. Duke Aldric had not come to sign an alliance, but to complete a conquest achieved through parchment rather than sword. "What do we do?" William asked quietly. King Edmund's hand moved instinctively to his sword hilt as he considered their options. To refuse the treaty now would mean facing Duke Aldric's wrath with only their own forces. To sign it would mean slow strangulation of their independence. Either path led to conflict, but one offered at least the chance to fight on their own terms. "We listen to Sir Gareth's counsel at last," the king said grimly, "and we pray his sword arm remains as strong as his judgment." The ceremony was scheduled to begin within the hour, and Duke Aldric waited below with his documents and his soldiers. The next few moments would determine whether Ravenshollow Castle remained the seat of an independent kingdom, or became merely another jewel in a conqueror's crown. The great hall buzzed with anticipation as nobles from both kingdoms gathered for the treaty signing. Duke Aldric sat at the high table, his weathered face bearing the confident smile of a man who had never known defeat in either war or diplomacy. His dark eyes surveyed the assembled crowd, with the calculating gaze of a merchant counting coins, while his fingers drummed impatiently against the polished wood. Lady Catherine sat beside him, her pale hands folded in her lap and her gaze fixed downward. Even beneath the elaborate silk gown chosen for the occasion, careful observers could see the tension in her shoulders and the way she held herself as if expecting a blow. The bruises Sir Gareth had mentioned were carefully concealed beneath powder and strategic draping of fabric. Sir Gareth stood with the other knights along the wall, his hand resting casually on his sword hilt. His eyes never left the Duke's soldiers positioned throughout the hall, noting how they had placed themselves near every exit and strategic position. What appeared to be ceremonial placement was actually a military occupation waiting to be declared. King Edmund entered the hall with Prince William at his side, both wearing their finest ceremonial robes, but moving with the measured steps of men walking to judgment rather than celebration. The assembled crowd rose as one, but the king's expression remained grave as he took his place at the high table. "My lords and ladies," King Edmund began, his voice carrying clearly through the stone chamber, "we gather today to witness what many believe will be a momentous alliance between our kingdoms." Duke Aldric leaned forward slightly, his smile widening at the king's words. Lord Reginald stood ready with quill and sealing wax, while servants prepared to serve the ceremonial wine that would celebrate the Pact's completion. The king paused, his gaze moving slowly across the assembled faces before settling on Sir Gareth. The poor knight stood straighter, recognizing the moment of decision had arrived. Years of loyal service and battlefield trust passed between them in that silent exchange. "However," King Edmund continued, his voice growing stronger, "wisdom demands that a king consider all counsel before binding his people's fate. Yesterday, Sir Gareth Blackwood, a knight whose honour I have never questioned, warned me against sealing this pact." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as Duke Aldric's smile faltered. His eyes narrowed dangerously, and his hand moved slightly toward the dagger at his belt. Several of his soldiers shifted position, hands moving closer to their weapons. "I have spent the night considering his words," the king said, standing slowly from his chair, "and I have reached a decision that will indeed shock this realm." The hall fell silent except for the crackling of torches and the distant sound of wind against stone walls. Every person present understood they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered in songs and chronicles for generations to come. King Edmund's voice rang out with royal authority. "I refuse to sign this treaty. I will not bind my kingdom to Duke Aldric of Northmarch, nor will I allow my son to marry into a house built upon cruelty and deception." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Duke Aldric's face flushed dark red as he rose from his chair, his hand now openly gripping his weapon. "You dare insult me in your own hall," he snarled. "You break faith with a sealed agreement?" Lord Reginald gasped in horror, dropping the treaty documents as if they had burst into flame. Several nobles began shouting at once, some supporting their king while others cried out against the madness of rejecting such a profitable alliance. But it was Sir Gareth's response that truly shocked the realm. The poor knight stepped forward from his place along the wall, drew his sword in one smooth motion, and knelt before his king with the blade laid across his palms in the ancient gesture of absolute loyalty. "Your Majesty has chosen honour over gold," Gareth declared, his voice cutting through the chaos. "I pledge my sword and my life to defend that choice." One by one, other knights followed suit. Sir Marcus of the Eastern March, Sir Robert the Bold, young Sir Thomas who had recently earned his spurs, all drew their blades and knelt in support of their sovereign's decision. The sight of 20 knights offering their lives in defence of principle sent a clear message that resonated throughout the hall. Duke Aldric's soldiers began moving toward their weapons, but found themselves outnumbered and surrounded. King Edmund's household guard had quietly taken positions during the ceremony, alerted by their sovereign's preparations. The Duke's trap had become his prison. "You have made a grave error," Duke Aldric hissed, his diplomatic mask finally slipping completely. "My armies will reduce your kingdom to ash for this insult." King Edmund stood tall, every inch the warrior king he had been in his youth. "Then we will meet them with steel, rather than surrender with parchment. At least our children will know we died free men, rather than lived as slaves." Prince William stepped to his father's side, his young face shining with pride and determination. The boy who had worried about breaking treaties had become a man willing to fight for his people's independence. As Duke Aldric and his delegation were escorted from the castle under heavy guard, the nobles of Ravenshollow began to understand the magnitude of what had occurred. Their king had chosen war over wealth, honor over security, and the uncertain fate of battle over the slow death of subjugation. 3 months after the failed treaty signing, Sir Gareth stood atop the battlements of Ravenshollow Castle, watching the autumn mist roll across the valley below. The expected invasion from Duke Aldric had never materialized, though not for lack of the Duke's fury. Instead, something far more remarkable had occurred throughout the realm. Word of King Edmund's choice had spread like wildfire across the neighboring kingdoms. The story of a king who chose honor over gold, who listened to the counsel of a poor knight over the promises of wealth, had resonated deeply with nobles and commoners alike. More importantly, it had reached the ears of Duke Aldric's other treaty partners. A messenger arrived that morning bearing news that brought smiles to faces throughout the castle. The Kingdom of Westmere had broken their pact with Duke Aldric after discovering similar garrison clauses hidden in their treaty. The Duchy of Thornfield had followed suit within days, and even the wealthy merchant cities of the eastern coast had begun questioning their agreements with Northmarch. King Edmund joined Sir Gareth on the battlements, his face showing the peace that comes from decisions made with clear conscience. The past months had been challenging as the kingdom prepared for war, but they had also brought unexpected benefits. Without Duke Aldric's silver to rely upon, the kingdom had been forced to develop its own resources and strengthen bonds with its true allies. "Your warning saved more than our kingdom," the king said, clasping the knight's shoulder. Duke Aldric's web of false alliances has begun to unravel. His own nobles grow restless as reports of his cruelty spread beyond his borders. Sir Gareth nodded. Though his weathered face remained serious, "Justice moves slowly, Your Majesty, but it moves nonetheless." The Duke's ambitions have grown too large for his grasp. Below in the courtyard, Prince William worked with the castle's master-at-arms, preparing for the knighthood ceremony that would take place at winter's end. The young man had grown considerably in the past months, his character strengthened by facing genuine hardship rather than the comfortable certainty of political marriage. He had proven himself not only in swordplay, but in the more difficult art of leadership, earning the respect of veteran soldiers through deed rather than birthright. A commotion at the castle gates drew their attention. A small party approached under a banner of truce, but these were not Duke Aldric's colours. Instead, they bore the silver and blue of Northmarch's eastern provinces, regions that had long chafed under the Duke's harsh rule. The delegation was led by Sir Marcus Ironwood, a knight whose reputation for honour rivaled even Sir Gareth's. Behind him rode a dozen lesser nobles, their faces bearing the grim determination of men who had made a difficult but necessary choice. "Your Majesty," Sir Marcus called as he dismounted in the courtyard, "I come bearing an offer from the eastern lords of Northmarch. We seek alliance with a king who values honour above gold." King Edmund and Sir Gareth exchanged glances before descending to meet the delegation. In the great hall, Sir Marcus laid out a proposal that exceeded their wildest hopes. The eastern provinces of Northmarch, comprising nearly half of Duke Aldric's territory, wished to break away from his rule and seek protection under King Edmund's banner. "The Duke's cruelties have finally exceeded our ability to ignore them," Sir Marcus explained. "When word reached us of your refusal to sign his treaty, of how you chose principle over profit, it gave us the courage to act on our own consciences. The offer came with significant military advantages. The eastern provinces controlled the mountain passes that provided Duke Aldric's easiest route to invasion. More importantly, they brought with them detailed knowledge of the Duke's remaining forces and his strategic weaknesses. Within a year, Duke Aldric found himself isolated and besieged by his own former subjects. The silver mines that had been his greatest asset became his prison as rebellious miners sealed the tunnels rather than work under his brutal conditions. His armies, deprived of regular pay and facing enemies on all sides, began deserting in large numbers. The final confrontation came not through grand battle, but through the quiet collapse of tyranny under its own weight. Duke Aldric died alone in his castle, abandoned by all but a handful of mercenaries, victim of a poison administered by his own servants, who could no longer bear his rages. Lady Catherine, freed from her father's control, chose to remain unmarried and dedicated her life to establishing schools for the children of former serfs. Her story became legend throughout the realms, inspiring other noble women to use their positions for the betterment of their subjects, rather than mere personal advancement. Sir Gareth was granted lands and title in recognition of his service, but he chose to remain in his modest manner, content to serve his king as he always had. His warning had prevented not just one disastrous alliance, but had sparked a transformation throughout the region, proving that sometimes the voice of conscience carries more power than armies or gold. Years later, when bards sang of these events, they called it the Poor Knight's War, not because it was fought by the poor, but because the wisdom of one humble knight had triumphed over the schemes of the wealthy and ambitious. The song always ended with the same refrain: that honor, once awakened, spreads like dawn across the land, illuminating truth wherever shadows of deception had fallen. King Edmund ruled for 20 more years, and his kingdom prospered not through conquest or exploitation, but through the simple principle that a ruler's first duty is to his people's well-being rather than his treasury's weight. The choice that had shocked the realm became the foundation of a golden age built on justice rather than gold.